Harvester of Sorrow. That, of course, is Metallica with Harvester of Sorrow, and a guy who can tell us all about the Harvester of Sorrow and the mob family is our good friend Scott Deitche. How are you, Scott?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on, guys, again.
Well, we're glad to have a mob expert on the line, on the come, who can tell us all about what's going on in that topsy-turvy world of mob shootings. So we had a big one this week, right, Scott?
Yeah, this was probably one of the biggest mob shootings in 30 years in New York. Frank Cali, who was the boss of the Gambino family, was killed outside of his house in Staten Island a couple of days ago, and he was shot a bunch of times. The numbers vary a little bit, and depending on the reports you read, but it was pretty brazen.
Right. Well, Scott, talk a little bit about who Frankie Boy Cali was, because I'm going to be honest. I mean, I follow this stuff, and I had kind of in passing heard his name, but he's definitely not, Paul Castellano or Gotti or recognition-wise. He's been a lot quieter of a guy. So who is he, and where do his mob ties come from and develop from?
So going back, he was born in Brooklyn in I think 1965. His parents are from Sicily. He starts showing up in mob reports around the early 1990s, and he has really close ties, both family ties, to Sicilian mobsters that were operating in the United States. So starting in about the late 90s, you see his name start popping up a little bit here and there. Supposedly he was officially made into the Gambinos in 97. And I don't know if you recall, back in 2008, there was that big mafia takedown day where they arrested 100 gangsters from the Northeast.
Right.
And he was arrested then, and at that time he was considered a captain in the Gambino family. And he was kind of part of the Sicilian faction. So he was going back and forth to Canada, where a lot of the Sicilian mobsters were. He was going back and forth to Sicily, tied into narcotics trafficking, allegedly, as well as loan sharking. The usual stuff, the gambling. But really, the narcotics was a big thing for the Sicilians. And somewhere around 2008, supposedly, according to some reports, he becomes the boss of the Gambino family at that time.
Okay, now what was it that opened up the door for him to take over the Gambinos? Did somebody die, or was somebody else clipped, or what happened there?
There was a guy before him called Dominic Cephalou, who's still around. He was 65, and I'm not 100% sure of the mechanics behind the scenes, but he stepped down, supposedly, and Frank Cali moved into his spot. And he's another guy who was tied in heavily with the Sicilians. So it was, and one of the things that you notice with the Sicilian guys is, like you said, you hear the name maybe in passing, but they're not out in front. They're really, do their best to avoid the limelight, to really stay under the radar.
Sure. Now, I didn't know these guys were allowed to step down. I thought I know once you're in for life, but I thought as you ascended, the only way you went out was death. No?
Yeah, there's been times, generally, yes, you're right, but there's been times when guys have kind of stepped back or stepped down. Jerry Katina and the Genovese family in the 1960s, he was a really powerful New Jersey guy in the Genovese family, and he was offered the top spot, and he kind of helped out a little bit, but then he stepped back and he ended up dying in his home in Florida, at a very ripe old age. So it has happened before. It's not really common, but it's not unprecedented.
Well, Scott, of the 5 crime families, who's the strongest one of the 5 at the moment?
Probably the Genovese family. They've always been, for probably the past 25 years, have been one, and actually even past them, they've always been one of the most powerful. They probably have the fewest rats, informants in their group, and they're one of the one of the groups that you don't ever really hear the names of the guys in the family or the bosses. So they're a lot more secretive organization as opposed to like the Lucchese's or the Colombos, who are, guys flipping and turning all the time.
Now, are all 5 crime families still, active as far as like the you always hear about the 5. Are all 5 still intact?
Yes, as a matter of fact, and one weird coincidence, earlier in the day when Frankie was killed at like 9 o'clock at night, earlier that day, the alleged boss and high-ranking captain of the Bonanno crime family were acquitted of racketeering charges in a New York courtroom. So the Bonannos are still active. The Colombos, even though Carmine Persico died in prison last week, they're still active. The Lucchese's are still active, and then obviously the Gambinos and Genovese. Now, the Bonannos and the Colombos, they've been riddled with a lot of law enforcement pressure, a lot of informants over the past 15 or so years. So they're not really as strong as they once were. That's for sure.
Well, with the internet and surveillance technology and whatnot being so advanced these days, what do these crime families consist of as far as their underworld dealings? I mean, what's the biggest revenue maker for these crime families?
Drugs, getting really big into the opioids, for sure. Gambling is still really big, but it's not, it's not your bookie at the neighborhood bar. A lot of them have moved with offshore operations, Costa Rica, the Bahamas. Now, the kicker with that is, with recent Supreme Court ruling on sports gambling, is, if sports gambling becomes legal nationwide, will there still be an avenue for them to make money that way? So still some of those traditional loan sharking, drugs, gambling, also a lot of stuff more along the line of, I would call, white-collar crime, more financial-type crime, things like bank fraud, money, more sophisticated money laundering operations. So they are kind of moving into some areas that the traditional mob in the past didn't. So basically anywhere where they can make money, they will find an opportunity to make money. Now, some groups like the Russians, they do a lot of credit card fraud, and other groups have kind of their own thing. But the mafia, especially still in like the New York area, aside from the core groups, they're starting to see a lot more stuff going into the more white collar crime activities.
Have they gotten, and I don't know how they would, but have they, and by they I don't only mean the New York or New Jersey, I mean, the Russians or whomever, have they gotten into like cyber hacking and stuff like that, where they would, they would actually have guys that are not necessarily tough guys, but they would have tech guys that are, building software and putting it, infecting machines and taking people's banking information and like that? Because it would seem like that might be a logical place where they could, if they can infiltrate, that they could stay a lot more hidden, which seems to be more the methodology of what they're trying to do these days.
Yeah, and you hit the nail on the head with that. A lot of these groups, different ethnic gangs and organized crime groups are absolutely doing things like that. Last year, I was at an event at the Mod Museum in Vegas. I'm a member of the advisory council there, so we had like a little group, and there was a guy from the FBI. I started talking to him, and he was kind of going through all this cyber. There's the cyber warfare, obviously, from kind of the more national security angle, but from the crime angle, a lot of the identity theft, hacking banking institutions, that's definitely becoming a big concern for law enforcement.
No kidding. Now let's go back to Frankie Boy Cali for a minute, because from what I read, and maybe you've read more or less or the same exact things that I've read, but to me, from what I read, it just sounds like he made a stupid mistake. From everything that I read, it kind of made it sound like he got a text or something that said, "Hey, meet me outside," and he went outside and got shot. Is that indeed what happened?
Well, as of the most recent stuff that I've been reading, and I don't know if you heard this, they did catch a suspect, so they arrested someone.
Not. No.
Yeah,
Turns out
some
that
24-year-old guy.
Yeah, yep. Turns out that this may not be a mob hit at all. That,
really?
Yeah, this 24-year-old guy who lives in Staten Island, not too far away, and also has a house in Jersey, was involved with, and this is just stuff I've read. This could change, but this is just some things that were posted not too long ago. Was involved with a female member of Cali's family, and he didn't want the guy involved with him. And there was basically, it was almost like a domestic dispute gone wild. And this guy, so yeah, what happened was he pulled up in front of Cali's house. He backed his car into Cali's car and caused like an accident. That's when Frankie came out. And then, you talked about surveillance footage. So from what I've read, the police actually have the surveillance footage from the Cali house that showed exactly what happened. And so, as more of that leaks out, it's going to be interesting to see exactly what transpired. And, of course, information just keeps kind of trickling out as it does when any active law enforcement investigation. So
sure.
Who knows? This might end up just being some kind of personal beef, and it'll be interesting to see what happens as this progresses. That's for sure.
If it is indeed a personal beef, this guy's whole family is dead, right?
It's not going to be. I don't think they'll be putting him in general population. Let's just put it that way.
Well, I'm thinking even beyond that. His mother, father, if he has brothers, sisters, they're probably all in jeopardy now, no?
Well, the mob generally doesn't go after the families. Now, the American mob. Now, if this was in Italy, that's a little different. Traditionally, there, you look at the mob wars in Sicily in the early 1980s. It was the whole family. It was So. But yeah, this guy definitely is probably has a target on his back for sure.
Wow. Well, Scott, what are you currently involved with as far as your involvement with documenting mob activity? What's your current project?
Well, I actually was going to be filming an episode for a Travel Channel show a couple weeks ago, but we couldn't get our schedules together. But I do that from time to time. Maybe thinking about doing another book here in probably within the next year. I have a couple ideas that I'm kind of popping around. But really, one of the big things I've been doing a lot of lately, because they've been really popular, I do a walking mafia tour in Tampa, in Ybor City, which is the old Italian, Latin neighborhood, Cuban, Spanish neighborhood where the Tampa Mafia started. And I just got back from Havana a few weeks ago. Again, we did another mob tour over to Havana, which was really cool, seeing some of the old, like the Riviera that Meyer Lansky used to own, some of Santo Traficante's old hotels that are still there. And then I write blog posts and articles for the Mob Museum. We do those mostly historical, like on this day, this kind of stuff happens. So yeah, keep them busy with the stuff. That's for sure.
No doubt, man. Well, Scott, I'm going to change directions a little bit. And if you don't know anything about this, just tell me before I even get into it. But are you at all familiar with the Whitey Bulger, specifically his takedown and trial?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. On you.
Well, I was watching a documentary yesterday or the day before on, I think it was on HBO, that documented his takedown. And there was a witness, I think his name was Scott Rakes or Steve Rakes or something, that was supposed to testify, then didn't testify. Then they found him dead of cyanide poisoning, but they tried to say, well, it really wasn't a mob thing to get him not to testify. It was a co-worker that didn't like the way he acted at work that poisoned him with cyanide. Are you familiar with that story at all?
I am. Yeah, that's a weird one. That's Is it plausible? Yeah. Is that what really happened? I don't know. It's kind of a convenient coincidence, and those are the kind of things that make you, start believing, maybe there is something else going on there. The real interesting thing that I've always found interesting about the Whitey Bulger takedown, when they arrested him in Santa Monica, he had been on the lam for, 16, 18 years at that point, and he still had $800,000 in cash and all those guns hidden in the wall. How was he getting that? Did he really stash all that much to live? California's not a cheap place to live.
Right.
And, he has all this money. That's always a question that's been unanswered. And, now with him being killed in prison, that's never going to be answered. So
sure.
There's something about that always kind of sat weird with me. And nobody can ever really come up with a good explanation.
Do you think that it was probably his brother helping him out and, doing his best not to get caught helping him?
Yeah, was it his brother? Was it some of the, people, in the old FBI that, were implicated in protecting him? Were they, did they not want him to be found because they didn't want him talking?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, no, Whitey Bulger, I'm going to be honest, I didn't know much about him. Obviously, I knew the name, but I didn't really know anything about him until Black Mass came out. And since I saw that movie, now I've watched 15 documentaries on him, and it really is he is like, not only him, but his whole organization is one of the most fascinating talking out both sides of their mouths. Whitey Bulger, till his dying day, said he wasn't a rat. Meanwhile, they got 700 pages of him giving up information. And Kevin Weeks said he'll testify against Whitey Bulger, but he wants it on the record that he's not a rat. And it's like, what were these guys delusional as to who they were and what they were doing, or were they did they have some kind of thought that they were like actually doing righteous work for the people? I guess I just don't understand versus traditional mafia guys that know that there's a code and they live by it, live and die by it. It seems like nobody in Boston did.
Yeah, and there has to be a level with Whitey Bulger, a definite sociopath, a deep level of narcissism there to have that.
Sure.
Exactly what you said, kind of be able to rationalize the duality of it. But in other ways, he was really smart and utilized that relationship with the FBI for so long to further his criminal career and basically take care of his competition.
Mm-hmm.
But
no,
yeah,
right.
he's a definitely interesting guy for sure.
Sure. Of all the guys that you have researched, whose story stands out to you as the the one where you're most intrigued by it, and maybe you still feel like you just don't know what really was going on with that character?
Man, there's a lot of, especially the early mob bosses that, before the media started catching on, before books started being written in the 50s, some of those really early guys where records are sparse, you always want to know more. But, and I'll always go back to Santo Traficante as being really an intriguing guy, especially in dealing, you get into the 60s with the whole CIA and the Castro, anti-Castro assassination plots and that whole conspiracy, wormhole that you can fall down with that. But there are a lot of guys that, even a guy like Jerry Katina, who I mentioned earlier, who was a really powerful New Jersey mobster, but was always just outside of the spotlight, just outside of the limelight, and you wonder how he managed to just make it through to the other end, where so many other wise guys kind of go real bright for a while, then burn out.
Right.
But
sure.
Yeah, some of the early mob guys, some of the early mob bosses, guys like Giuseppe Morello, the Claw, who early turn of the century New York. There's been a couple recent books written about him, but some of these early guys are really fascinating because you really have to dig deep to find the information for them.
Right. Sure. Now, one more. This is, and as you're aware, I can't stop watching these documentaries. YouTube, literally everything that comes up in my recommended from YouTube is mob this, mob that, mob this. Now, I watched one, and it was done by some guy and not like an expert. So I'm taking it with the grain of salt I should take it with. But I'm curious for you who knows this world a little better, if there's any truth to this or if this guy was just full of shit. I watched a documentary on how the mob was involved in Chappaquiddick with Ted Kennedy. And that was like another shot at the Kennedys by the mob, almost as payback for Bobby Kennedy and the whole JFK attack on them. Have you heard anything like that?
No, that's a new one for me. Honestly, I had not heard that at all.
Okay.
I'll have to check that out. That's interesting.
It's on YouTube. I forget what it's called, but I'll email you the link to it, because it was. I watched it, and again, it was a guy. It was one of those guys standing up in a hotel classroom with like 30 people in front of him with a slide thing talking about, well, this is why this was this and that. I was like, wow, I haven't heard this before. But one more, the Iceman, Kuklinski. I know you know all about this guy.
For sure.
Is there anybody, and before him, after him, as fucking sick as him? Because that's a sick dude.
Well, two things on that. Yeah, he's a sick guy, but you want to take that with a lot of grains of salt. His confessions of killing all these guys. There's a lot of issues with exactly how many. And again, we're kind of in the weeds there. How many guys did you kill? But he certainly. I think he certainly liked the limelight and started embellishing some of his his count. And then they had the whole HBO thing with him and the books. So he's definitely a sick guy, that's for sure. I would say the DeMeo crew from the late 1970s and the Westies, those are probably right up there too, with some really basically crews of sociopaths. The DeMeo crew especially, there's a really good book if you get a chance to pick it up called Murder Machine, and these guys were just chopping people up left and right. It was in this like the late 70s, early 80s New York, so pure gritty New York, and they just were right in the thick of it.
Jeez.
Well, Scott, with some of the recent, bedside confessions coming out, obviously one of the ones that, held the fascination of most Americans who are around to remember it. Do you believe that Jimmy Hoffa was, taken out at a house not far from, far from the restaurant where he met up with his colleagues, where they just killed him in a house and then took him over to a garbage disposal plant and got rid of him?
I think that's probably the most plausible theory, that he was killed in Detroit, that he was taken care of there. I know, I think it was Tony Zerilli who had come up, and the FBI went to that house. Supposedly weren't able to find any evidence, but I think that is a really plausible story. Obviously he wasn't in Giant Stadium, because when they built the new Giant Stadium, they didn't find him in the old one. But I think the theory the story that he was killed in Detroit near the restaurant, and that he was either I've heard, either garbage, disposed of that way, or crushed up in a car. But they're never going to find it. They're never going to find him.
Well, didn't they find some blood evidence under the carpeting or under the floorboards in that house, exactly where they said that it happened?
Yeah, but I think they said it was maybe inconclusive. But I'm not sure exactly how that ended up. That's something I can look up for sure.
Yeah, it was probably a lot more simple than most people think.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's like the Spilotro brothers. In the movie Casino, they kind of show them being killed out in a cornfield, but they were summoned to a basement of a house. They were beaten to death, and then some guy went and buried them in a cornfield. I mean, it's not these grand conspiracies. It was just
right.
Take care of the guy and get rid of him.
Yeah, well, that actually happened not far from where I live. Actually, I had heard that they had, gotten beat and, beat and tortured in the basement. They just loaded them in a trunk and buried them just a little south of where I live in a cornfield in Rensselaer, Indiana.
Yeah, and I guess they didn't bury him deep enough because the farmer saw the disturbed soil. And
too much, man. Well, Scott, one thing that's coming out, and I'm sure you've seen this, is that they're going to try and do a prequel to The Sopranos. And the last time when The Sopranos was hot, the family that it was sort of loosely based on, there's a documentary about those guys out there and about how they were all offended, but at the same time they raised their own visibility up because of the TV show. Do you think that same kind of thing will happen again with this new Sopranos movie that's going to be coming out, where these guys are going to kind of look at it again and compare themselves to it and try to live up to the hype, more or less?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. For your listeners that don't know, that's the DeCalvacanti family, and the FBI caught them on wiretap, talking about, hey, I think, Jackie Aprile is supposed to be you. He's like, no, he's supposed to be you.
Right.
It's kind of like, them comparing themselves. I think a couple of those guys that were caught on wiretaps are no longer around from natural causes and otherwise. So it'll be interesting to see. But from a pop culture thing, I think it'll be really interesting how it's handled. I don't know if you saw Ray Liotta just signed on to be in the movie, and James Gandolfini's son is playing his young Tony Soprano, which I think is really cool. So I think that'll be an interesting movie. And then, of course, you were talking about Hoffa before. The Irishman's coming out next year on Netflix, or later this year. With,
that's
Scorsese.
As somebody that lives here in Cleveland, it's funny. I was a little kid when all that was going on, in the mid '70s and whatnot, and I remember, when we would go down to Cleveland for baseball games, and my dad used to joke all the time about parking in certain places because he didn't want his car to get blown up. Oh. And you're 9 years old or whatever. It's like, haha, very funny, Dad. Meanwhile, he was dead serious because Cleveland was known for cars getting blown up, from the Irishman and that mob scene, man. Crazy stuff.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of that era and that genre, Scott, I don't know if you know anything about this, and if you don't, that's cool. One of my favorite congressmen who always spoke his mind, and there was always questions of his dealings possibly with the mob in the Youngstown, Ohio, Cleveland area, was Jim Trafficant, who, strangely enough, he got thrown out of Congress, did a stint in prison for a while, and then when he came back out of prison, there was talk that he was going to run again for Congress, and he just, strangely enough, a tractor turned over on him at his farm and killed him. So do you have any insight on any of that at all, or is that foreign to you, or what?
No, I definitely remember that. I definitely remember when that whole thing, and is it the Mahong Valley? I might be mispronouncing it, that whole area.
Yeah, Mahoning Valley, yeah. Mm-hmm.
When they had all that corruption going down, and certainly when he was indicted. Yeah, the Youngstown area was really interesting because you had the Cleveland mob and you had the Pittsburgh mob, who were both kind of active in that area. That was another one of those suspicious deaths. Your tractor falling on top of you. But I remember seeing him in Congress. He was definitely a character, that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I got to talk to him briefly. Actually, Chris and I were trying to get him on the show after he got released from prison, and he actually gave me a phone call. And I talked to him for about 5 minutes, and then within a matter of just weeks, that quote-unquote tractor accident happened, and he died. But boy, I'll tell you what, there was always some kind of probable or suspicious connection there when he was the sheriff of Mahoning County, and then he became a congressman from that area.
Yeah, that whole area is really fascinating, and I know a couple authors that have done some books really digging back in the history of Cleveland and Youngstown and Pittsburgh and that whole connection. I don't think people outside that area, or when they think of the mafia, think of New York, think of how that whole area, how involved it was, and how big the mob was there for so long.
Well, I was just like Chris. I was just a very young kid in the 70s, living over in Trumbull County, which is right next to Mahoning County, and I remember, without really understanding it, always hearing the name trafficant and the mob and Youngstown mob, and of course Chris brought up the Cleveland bombings, and it was just a crazy time, very turbulent time to be a young person and seeing the news and hearing the adults talk, and everything was oh, you don't want to go down in that area, that's where the mob is. That's where the mob is. Yeah, that's what I always heard, because I lived right outside of Youngstown, as a kid. And then when I was in my teen years, I was living in the Akron, Ohio area. This was long before I knew Chris, and Chris just lived a little north of me, so he was exposed to a lot of the same news and, discussion that I was. And it was just a very, very odd time in the 70s and into the early 80s.
Oh, I can imagine that, and and same thing kind of with me. I grew up in right outside New York, and I remember when Castellano was killed. Those things. It's kind of always in the background, and you hear about it. But the Youngstown bombing stuff was really interesting, and there was some interesting ties with Cleveland and Miami and the mob in Florida, specifically, Santo Trafficante. He had a couple guys, one guy, Stefano Randazzo, who was a Cleveland mob guy, who was basically Trafficante's driver in Miami, and another guy, John Peanuts Tronalone, who later became the boss for a short time of the Cleveland Mafia, were associates of the Tampa mob as well in the Miami area. So it just shows how interconnected even that area was to the rest of the mob, in other parts of the country.
Well, Scott, tell me. I know we're kind of veering all over the place. The more I talk to you, the more things come to mind. What was it? What is it about the New Orleans area that made that such a mob stronghold? What was the industry there? What is it that? How did the mob get established in New Orleans? Because you always hear, about the New Orleans connection, and obviously the speculation that the New Orleans mob faction had a lot to do with the assassination of Kennedy and all that kind of stuff. What can you tell us about that?
So the New Orleans mob is probably, by some historians' estimation, the oldest mafia organization in the United States. And when you talk about why New Orleans, well, there was an Italian immigrant community there. The industry there, shipping was big. The port of New Orleans was really big. But one of the things that Tampa was another city at that time that kind of had in common was, New Orleans was a Catholic city in the Protestant Deep South. So if you were an Italian immigrant coming into America, into the Gulf Coast, you were looking for work there, they gravitated to New Orleans. And you saw the emergence of a couple organized crime figures that came over from Sicily that started working in the fruit importing, vegetable importing business in the port, and that started the genesis of what later became the Marcello organization in New Orleans. And then you have the Vice, the whole Bourbon Street area, which was a long hotbed for Vice. You also have influence by some of the New York mobsters. Frank Costello was down in New Orleans, had some operations there. So it was a natural. There were some socioeconomic reasons. There was religious and cultural reasons why it became an epicenter of Sicilian immigration on the Gulf Coast, and then there was kind of that natural growth of a small mafia family. And what was interesting, too, is that the New Orleans Mafia, they were never really big in terms of the numbers of guys, but they definitely had a lot of influence. And certainly Carlos Marcello, maybe one of the more well-known mob guys, had a lot of influence for being both small in stature and leading a pretty small crime family.
Sure. Now, Scott, how how is it that like Los Angeles never became a huge mob hub? Because it just seems like all the elements that they would want are there. You know, with obviously there's a lot of money in it, and the entertainment industry is corrupt as fuck. You know, it just seems like that would be such a place for them to really take up roots, even more than New York City, because quite honestly, because the people are weaker. You know, they're softer in LA to where the mob could really mow them over. But it just doesn't seem like there's ever been a huge contingent like there are in other places.
No, and there's a few reasons for that. Is Los Angeles did have an Italian immigrant community, and there was an early organized crime. Jack Dragno is probably the most well-known of the mafia bosses, and certainly by the 1940s and 50s. But you didn't have the cohesion, you didn't have the size of the communities that New York or some of the Midwest cities had. A lot of the mob guys that eventually became mobsters in Los Angeles came from the East Coast. The other thing you had a way different law enforcement attitude towards organized crime in Los Angeles. It was a lot less corruptible. There wasn't as much of the neighborhood kind of connections, and the political dominion there, that's not really the right word, but the political establishment wasn't as ingrained in the corrupt elements as it was in some of the East Coast cities. So by the 1950s, when you have Mickey Cohen getting big, and certainly that's where Bugsy Siegel was killed, but law enforcement really put the pressure on them early, and it was just never able to really gain steam. I mean, they were heavily involved in the porn industry for sure. That was definitely probably one of their more lucrative rackets. But yeah, there was 3 mob families in California. There was a small mob family in San Jose, a small mob family in San Francisco, and the one in Los Angeles. But none of them were ever really super big or nearly as influential as the Midwest or East Coast families.
Yeah, it just seems even maybe even more today than then. Like that would be such an easy place to come in. And I know I'm mixing Hollywood movie with fact, but the scene in Casino, I guess, when Nicky comes to Vegas and just says, "Well, I'm taking over this town," and that's it. It almost seems like that somebody with that type of an attitude would have emerged in Los Angeles because it's such a softer environment with a lot of money.
Yeah, it's strange that it never took off there. It's probably the biggest city that didn't have that influence, for sure.
Well, Scott, is there any documentaries out there, mob documentaries that you personally have watched that you in your mind say, "Oh, this isn't very factual," or "That's not true," or this is you know, a little misleading, or whatever? Have you seen some, and if so, which ones have you seen, or does any come to mind at the moment?
Yeah, what Chris had mentioned earlier, the guy at the Holiday Inn in front of 30 people on the YouTube channel, those are generally the ones that are a little sketchier. I found that most of the like the show Mobsters that I'd done an episode of with A&E. I just did a Strange Inheritance on the Ma Barker house in Ocala. Some of these shows that have the bigger productions, they definitely do their research, and I found, you know, when I'm asked to be on a show, they have a lot of research and backup, and they'll ask me, "Hey, you know, was this right? Was this correct?" I would say you're in safe hands with most of those kind of the more well-polished shows, the ones that, you know, either were shown on History Channel or American Heroes Channel. Mafia's Greatest Hits is another one that's good. They've had some good stuff. But yeah, some of the YouTube ones I've seen that are like basically people have put together, or or, you know, like Chris's thing where you're just standing in front of people with a chalkboard. Those are the ones that generally you're like, I don't necessarily know if all this is quite true. So yeah, those ones, and I can't think. I've seen some of them, but I don't save them, so I don't know the names offhand.
Right, sure, I get you. All right, Scott. Well, we appreciate you taking some time and, kind of bringing us up to date. So, where can people find you and, all that kind of good stuff?
Amazon.com, all my books, ScottDeitche.com, which is ScottDeitche.com. They go to the Classic Metal Show Facebook page. You put up a link. Thank you very much to my books. And speaking of books, Chris, I have in the queue your Cause and Effect Turbo. Looking forward to reading that.
Oh, nice. Thanks. Sure. I should be reading yours. I still haven't gotten all the way through Garden City Gangland yet, but thank you.
It's a dense book. So, hey, two things I want to bring up, you guys, music related.
Sure.
I'm going to see Slayer in May for their final tour. It's Monomarth is playing, who I love them. I've seen them before. Lamb of God and Cannibal Corpse. Assuming, I don't know if you heard, the lead guitarist of Cannibal Corpse got indicted in Tampa for a home invasion last year. Yeah. So I don't know if they're going to be on the bill or not. But have you guys seen them on this tour? Their final tour?
I saw them on the last tour. I did not go on the final tour, but they always kill, man. I mean, Slayer is Slayer, and let's face it, even without Jeff Hanneman, Gary Holt is about as good a guitar player as there is. So, they're always really, really good. And Amon Amarth, they fucking rule live.
They're incredible. They're
good great live. Lamb of God, if you like their music, they're good live. They sound pretty much like their records. And Cannibal Corpse is actually touring. I forget who they got to step in, but they got somebody in the death metal world to step in. And let's face it, it's not the most difficult job in the world to play rhythm guitar for Cannibal Corpse. I could probably do it.
No. Yeah, I saw them years ago with Obituary. They're part of that Tampa scene down here.
Sure. Absolutely, man. Cool. But you'll have a good time at that show, man. That's good. That'll be you'll be icing your neck the next day.
Cool. And Neeley, I have a question for you, non-metal related.
Oh, okay.
So, it has to do with the band Chicago, which I know you're a huge fan of.
I am a big fan.
So I didn't realize until recently how influential and how long Bill Champlin was in Chicago. How come he wasn't inducted with them in the Hall of Fame?
Well, they had a falling out. Bill Champlin had a falling out. He was not part of the original band. He was actually brought in 1981. He was supposed to be the next replacement for Terry Kath, who had, unfortunately accidentally killed himself in 78. Mm-hmm. And he was an additional guy. He was always a sideman type person. And they brought him in, and according to Bill Champlin, he said that this is kind of strange because he spent so many years in the band. He spent 30 years in the band, but he said that he never had a good relationship with the guys. He said they wanted to get rid of me from day one, but because I wrote some hit songs and we did get some hit songs on the radio and stuff, it's just like, well, now we're stuck with this guy.
And Scott, don't let Neeley fool you. Neeley is the reason. You asked a question about Bill Champlin. Neeley is the reason that Bill Champlin got fired from Chicago, and that is not a joke. Go ahead, Neeley. Tell him that story.
Well, we have a good friend, Matt Wardlaw. He works for a radio company, and he gets opportunities to interview band members, for various releases. And Bill Champlin was out there getting ready to release a solo record. And the band Chicago is run by the 4 principal members that are left in the band anymore. And they more or less call the shots. They basically tell you, you can do a solo record, or no, you can't because we're doing promotion for this, or you're going to interfere with what we're doing and whatnot. Well, Bill just decided, I got a solo record. I'm going to release it. I haven't gotten it approved by the band, by the principal members. and I'm going to do this anyway. And so he went out on a press junket, and I think I was the first one to interview him for his release. And I interviewed him, released the interview the next day, and 2 days later he got fired.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's great.
Yeah, so I don't know how much influence is really there, but it's just coincidental that he got the boot within 48 hours of releasing my interview.
Yeah, a good story.
Yeah. So no, he wasn't an original member, and there was a lot of contentious relationships there, and he won't even talk about his time in the band. He just they've had a couple of documentaries. I think CNN did a documentary most recently about the history of Chicago, and they asked him to participate, and his answer was, well, my dad always told me if I had nothing nice to say, don't say anything at all.
Oh, that's great.
So I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yeah, no, that was worth it for that story. I didn't know about that.
What's unfortunate is that during the height of their career and during my vested interest in the band, I have seen them over 50 times, and it was almost like a yearly tradition for me to see them at least once, and I literally have not seen them in about 7 years because there's basically 3 guys left, and everybody else is a replacement player now, so I just don't have any interest in seeing that lineup anymore.
Yeah. Well, I tell you who I don't have an interest in seeing. We're playing Tampa this week, is spending $700 to hear Paul Stanley not be able to sing anymore.
Yeah, they're here tomorrow night, and I actually got offered free tickets and passed. I was like, nope, not even. I don't even want to pay to park to go see that bullshit.
Yeah, I heard some of the stuff, and you guys played a little bit. I guess that one thing you played from Barcelona with him when the logo was just horrid. Oh man.
So funny. Awesome.
All right, Scott. Well, again, we appreciate you taking some time and giving us your insight because, as you're well aware, Chris and I are just big Mob fans, and I know a lot of our fan base take a lot of our suggestions, and we'll look up or watch a lot of the things we talk about here on the show. So having a guy who's an aficionado when it comes to the Mob stuff is always fun to have you on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. Anytime. I appreciate having me on.
We're like a real show now because we have a Mob expert.
I'm your go-to guy.
Yeah.
I'm the guy.
Exactly.
You got a guy. You got a guy.
Yeah.
Nice.
All right, Scott.
Thanks a lot, guys. I appreciate it.
All right, Scott. I'm going to end this interview with something from a good friend of ours and a band we enjoy, Benedictum, our good friend Veronica, the V. She does a good cover version of the Black Sabbath classic, The Mob Rules.
Excellent.
All right, so here it is. This is Benedictum with The Mob Rules, and thanks again, Scott.
Thanks, guys. Have a good one.
Bye. Too, bro.
From Benedictum, and there's something really wrong up in here. On the Classic Metal Show!